welcome our speakers, all of whom have got an amazing track record that we can learn from, and certainly are highlighting issues that are becoming even more urgent for the Middle East and North Africa region. So welcome to everyone. This event is geared towards early career researchers in principle. So again, it's great that we are able to use the space of the network to reach out to colleagues who consider themselves as being active in some field related to social policy issues broadly defined, and that in some way we can support you in your aspirations or capacity building. So please do watch this space. And above all, thank you so much to Tamara and Noor for taking on this effort and really putting in a lot of life into these activities. Not to mention our project manager, Olivia, who's put in a lot of work as well behind the scenes. I'll just briefly say, if you know nothing about the MENA Social Policy Network, it's a pleasure to have you here. This is primarily a research and knowledge exchange platform that was established in 2012, focusing on social policy issues, defined not just as the delivery of welfare services, and I think that's probably the more predominant understanding of social policy that we tend to think of, but rather also thinking about the political space to articulate access to services and access to needs. And there are clear connections there with questions of political representation and a lot of the issues of underpinning inequality that hopefully we'll talk more about today. So I hope you have a chance to have a look at what we do. As far as possible, we try to promote knowledge sharing, research collaboration, and of course we have a wide base of supporters and colleagues that follow the network activities and take part in what we do, that are both from the research sphere, broadly defined, both in and out of academia, but also policymakers within government and within international donor agencies and civil society sector. So thank you again, and I hope we have a very good debate. I'm sure we will. And please get in touch if you've got questions about the network.
Thank you so much, Rana. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Khalid, Abu-Ismail and Vladimir, Dr. Vladimir Hlasny to share their points and thoughts on this topic.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you, Rana. Can you see the screen? Are you able to see the screen now? Yeah, okay, great. Thanks for this invitation. Really appreciate it. And I'll be speaking with Vladimir for about maybe 20 to 25 minutes on the issue of inequality, and look forward to having an interesting discussion on that afterwards. The issue of inequality, as we all know, is a rather complex one. So it's not one that can be easily covered in a short space of time. So what I'm going to be speaking on with Vlad is basically essentially the result of research that we did in the 2019 report that ESCWA and the Economic Research Forum did, with the same title of Rethinking Inequality in Arab Countries. There are also a couple of papers that Vladimir and myself did on wealth inequality in the Arab region that were published recently. And so I'm going to be drawing on both of these papers. So basically, we start with a review of the inequality in human development outcomes and opportunities. Again, one of the important issues here is to distinguish between these kinds of inequalities, whether we're talking about outcomes, opportunities, inequality between men and women, inequality between rural, urban, etc., etc. And I'll allude in the second part to the income inequality, which has taken a lot of the debate in the region, and particularly in light of the impact of COVID-19 on poverty. With that challenge, the COVID-19 challenge, therefore, comes the need for us to invent solutions. And Vlad and I have a proposal which is driven from the work that we did on wealth inequality in the region. And we're going to conclude with that proposal, which is basically to create a solidarity fund derived mainly from contributions of the wealthiest decile. So for those of us who have been following the literature, Arab inequality has become the topic of a lot of debate and discussions, especially after 2010. And there was a lot of discussion about the so-called Arab inequality puzzle. The World Bank, in a paper I think was published shortly after the Arab Spring, had basically put forward the hypothesis that the Arab region is essentially a low inequality region, of course, primarily looking at income data. But there seems to be a perception out there that the inequality is very large in income and non-income space. So that, I think, is an interesting proposal which we try to examine in our work. And our position is that it's not that simple, that the issue of inequality is a lot more complicated than to be put in those simplistic terms. And even in those terms, there appears to be an Arab inequality puzzle, but it's of a different nature. What do we mean by that? Well, to start off with, let's review a few stylized facts. And the first of these facts is that when we look at human development progress, when we look at the progress of Arab countries in health and education and income over the span of the last few decades, you'll see that most Arab countries have actually done quite well, and most of them belong to the medium, high, or even very high human development levels. Again, not including the latest environmental planetary pressure, HDI, but just looking at health, education, and income. You can see that very clearly if you just look at these graphs, where you can see here the mean years of schooling has almost doubled, even if we take the 1990 as a starting point and not go back to 1970. If we take 1970 as a starting point, 5 out of the 10 best performers in terms of global human development are Arab countries, Oman being the lead, and with Tunisia as well. So over the span of the last 2 or 3 decades, you can see that the average mean years of schooling has almost more than doubled from 3.2 to 6.9 years, just to give you an example. And of course, after 2010, some countries are lagging behind, especially the low human development category countries. Those include Mauritania, Syria. Unfortunately, Syria joined that group after 2012 or so because of the conflict situation, and Comoros and Djibouti. So it's again, we start to see inequality in human development achievements between Arab countries, especially after 2010. That's something that I would like to highlight, that the convergence that was there from the early 70s after 2010, 11 is now, we're seeing a lot of divergence between countries. This looks like a complicated graph. It's not, it's actually quite simple. And it summarizes a lot of the work that we have been doing. So on the vertical axis, you've got the achievement levels. And the higher the achievement you have going up here on the indicators going from stunting to completion rates, education completion rates, or skilled attendance of birth, etc., etc. And on the horizontal axis, you see the progress in inequality. So if you are in the upper left quadrant, you're essentially achieving average annual rates of progress on the indicators themselves. So you're reducing stunting, you're increasing completion rates, you're achieving lower infant mortality, etc. And at the same time, you're reducing inequality between the rich and poor on these indicators. That's where you want to be. And most Arab countries are in that quadrant. For example, If you look at Mauritania's completion rate, you'll see that they've managed over the span of the last 2 decades to reduce increase secondary completion rates by an average annual rate of 10% and reduce inequality between rich and poor at the same time by a similar rate. That's where you want to be. And of course, not all our Arab countries have achieved that nexus of reducing inequality and increasing achievement on all indicators. You can see Libya, for example, on stunting, it's managed to increase inequality and reduce achievement. But for the majority of indicators, for the majority of countries, it's been a rosy picture. And especially for secondary education. So if you were looking at secondary education completion rates and looking at the gap between the rich and poor in the earliest surveys close to 2000, you're going to have 6 times the likelihood of not having completed secondary education if you were coming from a poor family. That ratio has dropped down to 3 if you were looking at the same data sets for the Arab countries in 2018. Remarkable achievement. And you find more or less the same levels of achievements in primary completion, skilled birth attendance, infant mortality, and stunting, although to a lesser extent. Also, gender gaps, they've been closing in health and education. So I don't have the time to go into these details, but those are the main findings. However, if you still are concerned about the levels of inequality between rich and poor, despite this progress, if you look at the Global Human Development Report figures, the level of inequality, and especially in education, is still very high. And we're talking about the inequality between rich and poor, okay? So even after all of this decades-long progress, you still have high levels of inequality, and especially in education. And more so, if you look at the inequality in opportunities in education, in secondary completion rates, and you look at the explaining factors, you know, how much of this inequality was due to factors that lie beyond individual control, like the household wealth level, the completion rates of the family's household head education level, the gender, the location of where you live, etc., etc., you will find that, and that's basically what we refer to as inequality of opportunities, you'll find that this level of the similarity index, which measures this inequality of opportunity, is extremely high for education, secondary education, and it has actually increased. And that's what we call the Arab inequality puzzle. That's the real puzzle, that you've seen these improvements in outcomes in health and in education, but the opportunities, inequality of opportunities, is still very high, especially on secondary education, which is your pride and joy in terms of outcome achievements. So this uncomfortable juxtaposition between high levels and sluggishness of inequality of opportunities and quite impressive results on inequality of outcomes in this human development space is what we call in ESCWA the real Arab inequality puzzle. Okay, so the question that we put out there, is it just an Arab phenomenon or is it a global phenomenon? I don't really have an answer to that question, but I would say that perhaps that's a question that is worthy of investigation. Now I come to the second part. How am I doing on time? Okay, 5 minutes and then I hand over. The poverty story is also equally interesting. The Arab region is the only region where you have an increasing rate of poverty, regardless of how you measure it. You know, when you want to use $1 a day, $2 a day, $3 a day, whatever, or if you wanted to use national poverty lines after 2011, it's a story of increasing poverty. It's a story of the beginning of a shrinking middle class. It's a story of increasing vulnerability. And so that's the story, whichever way you look at it. It's not the story from the 80s up until 2010, where you do have a relative expansion of the income groups that we define in the middle. And of course, the middle class is a very complex notion that includes income and non-income dimensions. So I would say that, you know, what I'm talking about here is the income middle income group rather than the middle class per se. Now comes COVID-19, and we have the shocks that happen to household income and to national economies, and we're expecting that 16 more million people are going to be poor by national definitions in this region. So if you're looking at national poverty lines, you're looking at the situation in 2019, around 29% of the region's non-GCC population would be poor. 21, using the forecasts, if there was no COVID, you would expect that rate to have gone down to around 26. Instead, we're estimating it to go to 32%. And the difference then gives you our expected outcome of 16 more million people, with an estimated 116 million people to be poor in 2021. Not all countries are equally affected. Of course, we know the case of Lebanon, and we know that the situation is very different than from May 2020 when we did these estimates. So if I was looking at Lebanon, we're looking at a country that has witnessed in the span of 6 months almost doubling of its headcount poverty. So we have to be mindful that this region is especially sensitive to the COVID income growth shock. And there are reasons for that, but I'm not going to get into them. There are reasons because a lot of the population is clustered right above the poverty lines. So any small shock to income is going to result in a disproportionately high impact on the economic side, and especially on poverty. Now we come to the inequality story of the World Bank. And yes, it's true that the Gini's are low. And yes, it's true that the Arab countries on average have lower Gini's than their counterparts at the same level of income. And it's also true that whichever way you look at these Gini's, at least up until the COVID-19, 2018-2019 period, they have been declining. But it's not the whole story. You have to look at what's been happening to household incomes versus national economies. That's the untold stories. At the same time that we've been having quite impressive, in some countries, I would say, economic growth, on the whole, household growth, which was coming from surveys that ask people what's happened to your real income. Household growth has not been growing. And in fact, the gap between national income growth and household growth is becoming larger. Now, why is that? That's, again, another paradox, another puzzle that we think might be because we're not really capturing the top tier income. Perhaps that's one of the explanations. The income that goes to the 1% at the top that is not easily captured by these household surveys. Now, the World Inequality Report, Piketty and others have done some work on this, and they've tried to also lump together the Arab region as a whole as one country and look and re-examine the income inequality. And after they did their work, actually it turns out that the Arab region is the highest income inequality region in the world, much higher than the story that we get from, the World Bank POVCAL database. So inequality is in the eyes of the beholder, and depending on which measure you use, you're going to have very different results. Now, why again are we concerned about this? It's not just because these figures are academic. It's not an academic exercise. There's a reason why we are concerned about these rising vulnerabilities and poverty in the region. The region has one of the highest exposures to vulnerability because of the nature of economic growth, because of the lack of structural transformation, because of the fact that a big portion of the labor force went into informal low protection jobs over the past 2 decades. That's been part of the Arab development, economic development model. And therefore, you also expect that that's going to be a big source of the vulnerability and the income inequality between workers and capital owners, and even between the workers themselves, between the skilled workers and unskilled workers, is going to be a big story going forward in the region. So all of this then poses the question of what do we do? And in order to answer that question, Vlad and I started looking and digging deeper into the wealth side of the story. If it's true that we're underestimating inequality of income, possibly wealth, then maybe if we look at other data sources, we can find some interesting results and draw some concrete policy suggestions from that. Vlad, over to you. And I think you have maybe 5 minutes, if I'm not mistaken.
You have 5 minutes.
Sounds good. So I will talk about a very narrow topic. There's some echo. Maybe Khalid, if you could.
Can you see the slide now?
Yeah, but I can hear echo from myself. Okay, now it's better, I think. So, Khalid talked about different dimensions of poverty and inequality in the region. And he talked about inequality of opportunities, and he talked about the different opportunities by people growing up in richest versus poorest households. So naturally, we decided to look into the distribution of wealth in the region, and because that's wealth is can be viewed as an accumulated stream of incomes. So to the extent that we measure incorrectly the distribution of incomes, we may hope that by looking at wealth, we might capture any of the errors because they accumulate over time. Also, wealth is the number one opportunity that people have in their lives. The household wealth is typically included in surveys. We can measure it, and we see the clear link between the household assets and wealth and the outcomes of children from those households. Okay, given this, we realize that one challenge in the region is the scarcity of data on economic outcomes, especially on wealth. And so we don't have time for that discussion, but I will show a little bit kind of what data are available and what we try to do with it. And we had to use some statistical gymnastics to with the limited data available, to produce some results comparable across countries over time, and to make some policy recommendations with that. So the starting point was, well, why don't we look at the Forbes billionaires data and see how much wealth there is, what's the concentration of wealth, and so the stylized fact that we started with was that, well, there are something like 37 or 40 billionaires, depending on the year, holding approximately $108 billion. And when we compared that at the regional level, when we compared it to the rest of the distribution in the population, we found that the concentration of wealth is quite impressive. These 37 individuals have wealth equivalent to the holdings of the bottom half of the population, the bottom 46%. This is also equivalent to the GDP of Morocco or the GDP of Yemen and Sudan combined. So very large concentration of wealth. And we started formulating, trying to get better estimates of the distribution of wealth by country, and formulating some policy recommendations based on that. So here, again, as I said, data on economic outcomes and especially on wealth are very limited. So first we started with information from the Forbes billionaires lists. That's where we got that's where we realized that these data are not very consistent. Billionaires come in, come out of the sample. For some countries, like for some of the Gulf countries, we don't have, or for Iran, we don't have data at all, maybe for political reasons. And so we had to search for other data sources. And we settled on a conservative but consistently collected source, the wealth reports by Credit Suisse, which are reported for countries worldwide year after year. And even though even these data have problems, we take it as the most careful, systematic source to use to look at the distribution across countries. So in columns 3 through 5 in this table, we see the example of data available from these Credit Suisse reports. We have the real wealth per adult in each country. We have the number of adults in each country, and we have the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of kind of a conservative measure of inequality of wealth in each country. We don't have any other information. And this is where we employed some statistical kind of gymnastics, and we relied on long and worldwide literature on regularities in the distribution of incomes and wealth across countries. And we, based on these very limited statistics, we estimated kind of a synthetic, continuous, full distribution of wealth in each country. Okay. Khalid, if you could go back one. Okay. And just to, so with these smooth, continuous distributions of wealth in each country, we had a picture of the distribution of wealth in the entire region. So on the right side of the table, I will just point to 4 statistics which are interesting. So we're looking at, for example, Qatar and Sudan. We, for example, find that now that we're talking about the billionaires versus the bottom 46% of the population by wealth, we see that in Qatar, for example, only less than 1% of individuals fall in the region's bottom half of the population, while 64%, 63.9% of Qatari population are among the top 10% of region's wealthy. Okay, Sudan, on the other hand, we find that 97% of Sudanese adults, or almost 20 million individuals, are in the bottom, in the poorest 50% of the region's population, and 0%, essentially nobody in Sudan is in the top 10% of the region's wealthy. Okay, Khalid, next slide, please. So constructing a full distribution of wealth in the region, we find something like this. This is a Lorentz curve where we can compute the Gini coefficient. We see a distribution looking like this. The color code is that red dots represent the least developed countries and conflict countries. Green dots are middle income countries, and the blue dots, if I'm correct, are the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. And we find that there's very little overlap across populations in the 3 groups of countries. Among the bottom 46%, we only see individuals from the least developed countries. Among the top 10% of in the whole region, we only see blue dots, meaning those are the individuals from GCC countries. And in the middle, we have thank you, Tamara. We have generally the population of middle income countries. Khalid, next slide, please. So the basic message was that there is not that much overlap in the wealth of population in different countries, which is the message that Khalid referred to earlier, referring to Piketty's research, that viewing the region as one country, we see these huge differences between, let's say, the Gulf, the middle income, and the least developed countries. Now, given this, we realized that we would have to really talk about transfers of funds across countries huge transfers of funds between the Gulf, middle income, and least developed countries, which politically are not viable today. And so instead of looking at the regional level, we really need to look at the national level. How in each country, how does the concentration of wealth compare to the poverty in that particular country? So on this table, we show the national statistics. So at the top, we have middle income countries, Algeria through Tunisia, mix of the middle income countries. And then at the bottom, we have least developed countries from Comoros to Yemen. And for each country, this table shows some summary statistics. Most importantly, given these estimates that we've done, we find that in the middle income countries, the top 10% of individuals by wealth held 1.4 trillion, so $1.44 trillion, and that compares to, on the other hand, focusing on the poor population, and namely at the funds that it would take to lift the poor above the poverty threshold. That's the cost of poverty gap in 2019. We found that it was only $12.95 billion. So we have a large mass of wealth held by the top 10%, and the cost of actually lifting the poor out of poverty is not that high. And so one kind of counterfactual scenario that we proposed: why don't we impose a tax on the top 10% to help the poor? How large would this tax have to be? Well, in 2019, we found that in the middle income countries, the required tax would be only 0.9, less than 1% of the wealth owned by the richest 10%. In 2020, because of COVID, the numbers are a little bit different. So the top decile wealth is estimated at a 1.3 trillion. The cost of poverty gap in 2020 is 15.6 billion. And so we would need a tax of something like, or transfer of something like 1.2% of the wealth of the richest 10% to finance the poverty eradication by year. In the least developed countries, so the last minute from me will be that, well, the numbers are completely different in the least developed countries. The top of the wealth distribution is much lighter. We estimate that there is only $72.6 billion held by the top 10% in LDCs, compared to the cost of poverty gap in 2019 of 25.7 billion. So that means that annually, if we wanted to fund poverty eradication by voluntary transfers or tax on the top wealth, we would require a tax of 35%. And that level is unsustainable. And we find that this policy proposal would not hold in the least developed countries. Another type of policy intervention is needed to combat poverty in least developed countries. Khalid, over to you.
Thank you, Vladimir. Even though you didn't stick to the 5 minutes, but I'll try to conclude in less than a minute here. So all of this is basically leading us to one very big question, which is, why isn't my slide working? Okay, for some reason it's not. Oh, there it is. Okay, which is the following: can you continue on with the same model, the same economic development model? Can you, as Arab region, continue on with this rentier, fast growth-oriented, heavily neoliberal oriented in some countries economic development model? And the answer is, well, you can't, for very obvious and even non-ideological or fiscal orientation related reasons. Your debts, your fiscal space is not going to allow you. So if you look at the sheer level of debt, the way it's been growing, and the pace at which it's been growing, you can't continue on like that. Something has to give, something else has to give, okay? So this is the last slide. We can do something about it. Our wealth proposal is just one minuscule, one tiny policy intervention that we think is doable. Now, can you do this at the national level? Do you need the regional level support? Even take this at the global? That's another question. But as we said, this is just an example, a small example of something that if there is political will, there are enough resources out there that can come together in a concerted effort to combat this rising inequality and poverty that we've been seeing, especially after 2019. Sorry for taking too long, and over to you.
Thank you so much for your talk and for giving us a lot of food for thought. But before we open the floor, I would like to ask Nadim from the Arab Reform Initiative to share his perspective.
Thank you very much, Tamara, and thank you, Khalid and Vladimir, for a fascinating presentation. I should start with one caveat. I'm not an economist, so my remarks are not going to be about the numbers or the underlying economics, but I want to pick up where actually one of Khalid's last questions, which is if there is the political will. And this is the question that interests me the most, which is what would it take politically to do this reform, and particularly the wealth tax, which I fully agree with. And in a way, when you look at the numbers, particularly for the middle income countries, 1.2%, let's say it increased even a bit more, it's really nothing, right? So why aren't we jumping on this recommendation and implementing it? And I think it's because the politics right now in the region are not adding up. And if we want to tackle inequality, we're actually going to have to politicize it. And I'll get to by what I mean in a second. I think I think we're living in an inherently political moment, frankly, in the region, but also globally. I think in the region, it started about 10 years ago. Globally, COVID-19 has, in a way, politicized the question of inequality. And by that, I mean, pre-COVID, most people that were interested in issues of taxation and inequality, if we were attending a seminar like this, it would actually be highly technical and would barely elicit outside interest. At the Arab Reform Initiative, the center I run, we had a webinar on taxation in Lebanon a few months ago. It was a full house. Frankly, I was shocked. It was probably one of our most successful webinars, attended by journalists, activists, and my mother, who doesn't usually care about taxation. By that, I mean inequality now, and I think in the region, because of the crisis, but increasingly with COVID-19, is finally being seen as to what it is. It's a political decision as to who is going to contribute to the collective good. Now, and I just keep that thought in mind for a second. Now, how can we go about imposing new taxation? So if I sort of pick up, and I actually think the policy proposal of a wealth tax is essential, let's talk about it sort of at a national level. How would you go about doing it? Now, you could say, look, Nadim, I mean, tax and politics have always been interlinked, right? The no taxation without representation argument, that sort of has always been around. And usually the way, I think there are sort of two levels of thinking of the politicization of these, of inequality and of the taxation question. Historically, and maybe more like, 2 years ago, because this is how, the last year feels like it's been going on forever. But I think historically it would have been, well, look, if you're going to impose new taxation, you need to have some political reforms on the margin to kind of create a bit more transparency, so there's a bit more trust, so people are willing to chip a bit more, right? If you're going to tax a bit more, give a bit more transparency. And I think that would have been true. But I think clearly insufficient today. That level of analysis and that level of political reform that is necessary, I think, particularly for the Arab region, for most countries in the Arab region, is still essential, but no longer sufficient. Because the second layer of analysis, I think today, is we're tackling broader legitimacy questions about taxation today. We're living in a region where the social contract in a number of countries is completely collapsing. And also where the wealth concentration is linked to the political economy. I think Khalid, I don't know if it was Khalid or Vladimir, talked about sort of the rentier sort of economy, extractive, sort of the wealthy. The billionaires in the Arab world are not like the billionaires of the west coast of the US, right? Lebanon has 7 billionaires, almost all of them have been prime ministers, right? They haven't invented Amazon, they haven't invented Google. It's an inherently sort of capital and politics are very interlinked. But so what I'm saying is the second level of analysis of the politics of taxation is it's no longer enough to talk about incremental political reforms or a bit more transparency. The sort of discussion that is needed today is what is the vision for a country? What is the legitimacy that ties these people together so that some people would accept to pay more taxes and others would feel inequality is a bit more sustainable. And I don't have an answer to that other than to say the situation is quite bleak on that level. And again, I'm going to use the example of Lebanon to show how difficult it is to get even consensus on small measures. So, I mean, Khalid and Vladimir would know the numbers better than me. So I'm charting, I'm a bit in dangerous territory here. But by most economic estimates, if the political and economic elite of Lebanon had agreed to some, form of haircut on their deposit in the system, sort of accepted as their sort of, form of paying taxes. It's another way of thinking of sort of wealth tax into kind of the greater collectivity. We could have saved, I think, by some estimates, 90% of banking accounts in Lebanon. 90% of the population that had sort of dollar deposit would have been made whole. The numbers were really not that scary, and it would have probably required an effort by 100, 200 key people in the country. And despite all of this, they refused. And they blocked any reforms and actually ended up in we're in this sort of irrational situation where everyone is going to be made to lose a bit more, with the exception of a few bank shareholders. And no one could impose that change. So this is, for me, an example of how the politics today of inequality are so important, and why it's going to be such a challenge to push for wealth taxes, even if it's a wealth tax of 1.2%, which really should, given how much we could achieve with it in middle income countries, should be a no-brainer. And yet it seems so hard these days to get that political momentum. So now, why is that? So why has it become so hard? Of course, I think we can talk about the neoliberal economic regime. I mean, that's a global problem with this sort of, you can add sort of a layer of analysis looking at how the economies in the Arab world have become increasingly dominated by sort of rent-seeking behavior at all levels amongst the economic and political elites. And sort of the third factor, which I just gave you an example of, is how that any attempt to kind of even reform the system, modernize it, improve collection of taxation, or try to tackle inequality is often systematically blocked by politicians who are close to this economic elite and sometimes are the same characters, even if it just hurts their short-term interests. Even if you manage to convince them that actually in the medium to long term, it would be in their own self-interest to pay more into the collective pot. And I think for me, this is one of the mysteries. They're still refusing to do so. And that could, again, is this about political trust? Is this about just maybe the sort of economic elite that have developed in the region over the last 20 years, which tends to be an elite that is able to, they're no longer really industrialists, right? I mean, it's very easy for them to put their money in Switzerland or elsewhere. So I'm conscious of time and I want us to have time for discussion, but so how do we address these challenges? I mean, if you agree that the diagnosis that Khalid and Vladimir made today is absolutely correct economically, that there are actually policy prescriptions that can help tackle the problem, then what would it take to generate this political will? And here I'm going to try to finish with 4 potential ideas. I start by the one which is we need to politicize the conversation about inequality. Okay, this isn't a moment where we can find technical solutions. We need the technical solutions, but for them to be implemented, they need to be carried by political ideas and political visions. I know this might be a bit controversial, but it's clear at this point that left on their own, even the best crafted arguments will not convince the political and economic elites of doing what's right. I mean, I gave you the example of Lebanon. I could have given you the examples of Tunisia. I could give you some examples of many other countries where one is baffled by the inability to do the right thing. So I think that's one. 2, when we talk about politicizing the conversation, bringing my mother into the conversation and thinking about inequality and really creating an engaged citizenry that cares about taxation and wants to understand where their money is spent and who is paying and who is not paying, because this has actually been missing, you also need to then publicize the conversation. We need to broaden those who are listening, engaging on these issues. A statistic like 1.2% is enough, a tax of 1.2% on wealth is enough to tackle kind of, most egregious forms of poverty, should become a household number. It should be something that the 8 p.m. news shows lead with. People need to sort of be conscious of it. But that's also not enough. For this to work, you need social movements that are also able to understand these issues, are sufficiently comfortable with the policy environment, know the ins and outs, are willing to engage with these issues and to carry them forward and to have conversations. That is a major challenge today, in part as a result, again, of the fragmentation of social movements in our region, the absence of, what traditionally would have been kind of the leftist parties as well are very weak, very divided. They barely actually analyze sort of economics today. It's much more about big sloganeering in most contexts. And actually the labor movements have been either completely co-opted by the regimes or by security instruments. So that's the second one, publicizing the conversation. I think 3, and I think the presentation by Khalid and Vladimir, talked about it, particularly with these sort of, how do you reconcile the notions of inequality between when you look at the World Bank numbers or when you look at what the Piketty team and others have done and so forth. And I think there's here a broad research agenda to better understand poverty and inequality in the most underrepresented groups. And I think here there's a real big space to sort of understand this. When we look at data, for instance, from countries like Lebanon or Jordan, how do you think about numbers how do you include refugees, Palestinians and Syrians who are likely to be there for a long time? How do you think about, when you look at the Qatari numbers, what about the population of migrant workers who are there? How are you thinking about all these issues? I think it's going to be a really, we need to really think about how do we include in our research, in our conversations, some of these underrepresented groups? How do we capture them in the data and how do we create as well spaces for them to talk about the subjectivity of their experiences. I think one of the Khalid talked about the inequality puzzle in MENA. I think one of the puzzles as well is when the Arab uprisings began, Tunisia was supposed to be a success story, right? I mean, it was a textbook, relatively success story, right? Not doing super great, but had, around 3% growth, I think, doing much better. All the metrics were look on the up and up. And sort of suddenly people discovered that there was, being a bit provocative, it's not that people discovered, but that the inequality in the interior that people expected, but that it would find such an echo as well in the so-called well-off areas of the coast that really joined the protest movement, should make us pause and think about what are we missing in our research tools to understand this underrepresentation. And finally, I'll just conclude with this idea. The wealthy are not just wealthy in our region. The wealthy are inherently political. And if I gave the example of Lebanon, I could have given the example of Syria, the saga with Rami Makhlouf or not. Maybe if you go to the Gulf states, when, the shakedown that Mohammed bin Salman did on members of his family and so forth. The wealthy are, yes, they're economic entities, but they're inherently tied to the political and security structures of the country. And I'll leave you with that thought. And here lies the challenge of inequality in the region, that to tax those super wealthy, even if it is in such a reasonable and well thought proposal of 1.2% for middle income countries, you are going to be taxing the cousin, the nephew, the central bank governor, the head of the army, and suddenly that conversation becomes a lot more complicated. And we need to be thinking about what constellation of political forces inside and outside would it take to convince them to pay voluntarily that 1.2% increased taxation. Thank you, and I'll stop right there.
Thank you so much, Nadim. So yeah, we find that it is possible to close the poverty gap, but we need to think critically about the political element that is underlying it. How can you come to a solution?